Welcome back in. It's good to see you. Hope you're doing well. This is the 2020 offseason. Today we're covering the Raiders, specifically the quarterback position and in depth the offensive line. We'll start in just a second by taking a look at an overview of what the Raiders offense did last year, and then we'll start working our way through the players and through some of the numbers and some of the grades. Okay, so last year 7-9. Not a bad record considering how bad the defense was last year. So 7-9, you still had a shot at the playoffs. It just didn't happen. The offense actually performed very well last year. We're going to walk our way through this. Yards per game, number 11 overall in the league. So they were turning out a good number of yards overall. When you look at passing yards per game, they were number 9 overall, so they were in the top 10 passing yards per game. When you look at the rushing yards per game, they're number 13 overall, so you see a lot of balance there. Probably better balance than most teams in the NFL have. These days, most teams in the NFL are pretty much worried about getting the ball, passing the ball around all over the place, and then just using kind of the running game as a bit of a counterpunch. But the Raiders actually had a pretty good balance this year with Josh Jacobs back there at running back, just an absolute stud. So they had a powerful running game this year, along with a good passing game. So they had a lot of balance, which made it harder for their offense to stop, of course. And then you come down here, the yardage is all good. You come down here to points per game, and they're number 24 in the league. All right, and that just really kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. If you're the Raiders and if you're Raiders fans, why in the world would they have an offense that seems to be turning out this much yardage all year? And they did. They had good yardage totals, and yet the points per game is way down. And your first instinct is, well, we must have been turning the ball over a lot. But then you look right here at turnovers. They're number 8 in the league at taking care of the ball. When you combine the fumbles and the interceptions and put them together, they were 8th best in the league at taking care of the football. So then you start to wonder, is the play calling. When we're driving the ball down the field, listen, I didn't watch every drive this year. I didn't watch all the ends of all these drives to tell you what really took place there. But just looking at the statistics this year, you see clearly that the Raiders had no trouble moving the football up and down the field. They had a good offense, but they had a lot of trouble scoring and getting the ball into the end zone. And so you start to wonder about the play calling, and can they improve that inside the 20 this year? Maybe they get a little bit too conservative there once they start getting down toward the goal line, especially when they can run and pass the football. You've got to question the play calling there, even though you have to give the quarterback and the offensive coordinator credit for putting together an offense that can turn out this much yardage, and they did. They turned out a lot of yardage and were able to be balanced too. So then you have to question, okay, are we getting a little too conservative down toward the goal line? Is our play calling need to be changing gears a little bit, draw up some new plays or just some new designs as we're getting close toward the goal line? So that's what we're looking at here. Over on the quarterback side of things, you had a good offense. Did you have a good quarterback? And the answer is yes. All right, you had probably, I don't think Derek Carr has ever been an elite quarterback. I don't really think he's ever going to be, but Derek Carr is a guy that you can win with. All right, this is a guy, we talked about it last offseason. This is a guy who can produce yardage, who can get the ball downfield. He's not a runner. He'll never be that, of course. But this is a guy who can pass the football and do so very effectively, turn out first downs. And so he's making $21.5 million this season. For a quarterback, that's a relatively small cap number. You're not down there in the discount place where the rookie quarterbacks are, so you don't have the great value there. But as quarterback numbers go, Derek Carr's is actually pretty good, 21.5. You think about Dak Prescott over in Dallas is searching for a contract somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 to $35 million, okay? Patrick Mahomes over in Kansas City is going to be looking for a contract somewhere in the neighborhood of $35, maybe $40 million. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets $40 million a year if he tries to stick to it and get top dollar, okay? So when you think about those kind of numbers and you come back and you see that Derek Carr is signed for $21.5 million this season. And not only that, you've got him for like $20 million next season and $19.5 million in the season after. You've got here not an elite quarterback, but you've got, I think, an upper middle half of the league quarterback here who can get you first downs, who can move the chains, who can direct the offense, who can win. You've got this guy locked up for a relative discount here as quarterbacks go. So you've got a very good deal here. Now, something has changed here with the finances, though, for Derek Carr over last season. During last year's offseason, speculation was rampant that John Gruden and Derek Carr weren't getting along, and that John Gruden was looking for a different kind of a quarterback, and that maybe they're going to release Derek Carr. One of the big reasons, I think, and we'll never know for sure if that's how John Gruden felt or not, but one of the reasons why they did not and could not do that last year was that it would have cost them $6.5 million just to let Derek Carr go. So not only did you have, I think, the $22 million cap hit that you would have had to pay Derek Carr last season no matter what, it would have cost an additional $6.5 million. So basically Derek Carr's cap hit for last year, if they wanted to trade him or release him, would have been $28.5 million just to have him not be on the roster. So that really was never going to happen last offseason unless John Gruden was just so glued to that idea of I've got to get a different quarterback. Now, this has changed this offseason. He's making $21.5 million as a cap hit. To release him or trade him only produces $5 million of dead cap space, all right? So not only could you have an enormous cap savings, but if John Gruden is looking for a different quarterback, if he just doesn't like the style that Carr puts out there, if he's wanting a different quarterback, he can do that now this year. The finances have changed drastically in favor of that being a valid option, okay? So even though I haven't heard as many rumors about that this year, don't know if that's going to happen after Gruden and Carr have put together a good offensive season. Don't even know if that's even on anybody's mind anymore, but financially that has changed, and that is now a very real option if that's something they wanted to do. Don't know if they're going to do that. Don't have any inside information on that at all. But that's just something to keep in mind here, that the finances have changed drastically from one off season to the next. Okay. After that, with quarterbacks, you have here Peterman, Glennon, and Kaiser. Peterman and Glennon will both be free agents this off season. I would be very interested in bringing Glennon back. I think I like his experience and his playing time as a backup. I would never want Glennon to be my starter, but I certainly do like him right here as a backup. For about $2 million, you can have him on the roster. I think that's a good guy to have as your backup or even your third string. Kaiser's only going to cost you $1 million, and even though I don't really think Kaiser's even that good of a backup in the NFL necessarily right now, I think that's somebody that you can have on the roster for cheap, somebody who has seen some playing time as well. Nathan Peterman being a free agent, I would be glad to just let him go. I really don't even see Peterman as being the kind of guy I would want on my scout team. I'd really just rather sign another, if I'm getting a young quarterback, get somebody out of the free agent rookie class or draft one there. So it remains to be seen what Gruden really thinks about Carr this year, because financially he can do that. I would at least like to see the Raiders pick up somebody in the draft, 5th, 6th round, whatever, just as a project to kind of work on here. But that's what you're looking at financially. The offensive line, this is where we're going to spend a little bit of time at today because there's so much here to talk about, all right? And I want to start right here with Trent Brown. Trent Brown is making a mind-numbing, a staggering $21.5 million this season, okay? That's a ton of money for anybody who isn't playing quarterback, okay? For a top wide receiver, for an edge rusher, this is a boatload of money. This is a lot of cap space to be handing to one player. They can't do anything about it this year in terms of release or trade, which I don't think they're wanting to release or trade him anyway, because they just did get him last year, and he had a solid season, and he made the Pro Bowl. $21.5 million is the dead cap hit, though, so he is on the roster this year no matter what. Even though he's got an enormous cap hit, he is going to be on the roster, even if financially we're wanting to let him go, which I don't think they're going to do because they signed him to that much money last season. What they could do is restructure the contract, but that's a little bit difficult because his contract numbers for the next 2 seasons are floating right around $15 million for each season. So you're not going to be able to come off this $21.5 million much, even if you restructure a healthy part of it to the next 2 seasons. The next 2 seasons, if you did that, would start to become in the neighborhood of $19 million for each season. And even so, even if you could run this number down to, say, $13.5 million this year, you got an even bigger bite for the next 2 seasons, and you lose a lot of flexibility over the next 2 seasons. So you're really not going to be able to restructure much out of this $21.5 million. Now, let's move past the cap number for just a second. Trent Brown did make the Pro Bowl this year, but that's a bit tricky. When you look at Trent Brown, he is not an elite left tackle, and he is not even really in the class of the upper echelon of left tackles or tackles in the NFL, period. I'm not even totally sure that the Pro Bowl designation should have been awarded to him this year. You look at a number of tackles around the league this year, I thought, that should have gotten this instead. I'm not trying to tear him down, I'm not trying to make fun of the team, but when you look at this, that Pro Bowl selection is a little bit deceptive. Now, he had a good season. He's very balanced. He can run block and pass block. He's a good anchor there. He's a good bookend. So I think you're happy with him as a player. I think you're getting what you thought you would get when you picked him up last season, but even so, this cap number is enormous. Having said that, he can lock down that tackle position. I think you feel very good about him at tackle going forward to next season. The other side, the other tackle spot with Colton Miller. Colton Miller in 2018 wound up starting, I think, most of the season, if not all of the season. I can't remember. He shouldn't have been starting at all in 2018. He just wasn't ready, but there was nobody else to play. So it had to be Miller. It had to be the guy that you invested a high draft pick in. And so, the flip side of that was, even though the offensive line suffered greatly, massively in 2018, he starts to get a lot of experience. He gets the playing time that he so desperately needs. And because of that, we saw a lot of progress in 2019. Miller, even though he didn't set the world on fire in 2019, was a solid starter, okay? This was a guy who, if you continue to see progress, you're going to feel good about, okay? So you've got him under contract for at least the next 2 seasons if you want him. And the cap number is only $3.7 million. So if you want him, if you can see him continuing to progress, I don't want him to stay what he was in 2019. I need him to step up and be more. But I think he can do that. So entering this season, the cap number aside, you've got 2 tackles here that you feel very good about. Miller, if he continues to progress, continues to get better, continue to just lock down that starting spot. And of course, Brown right here, who is very well-rounded and a very good and very solid player, pretty much in all phases of the game. You feel very good about your tackles. After that, Parker has struggled, to say the least. It has not been good. Matter of fact, you look at how he's played and the development, and there just isn't any development at all. And so it really doesn't look like this is going to work out. But the cap hit for him on the team this year is only $1.1 million. And if you wanted to release him, you wouldn't even be saving but about $600,000, okay? So really, if you think there's any chance that he can develop into at least a solid backup, if not a starter in a season or 2, if you think there's any chance, and there's every reason to keep him on the team because you have invested the draft pick in him a couple of seasons ago. So he's not ready to start. He's really not even much of a very good backup right now at this point. But I think you'll see him stay on the team, at least get a chance to compete for a backup job this year. And then, of course, David Sharp, your draft pick from a few years ago, he's only costing you $735,000. At this point, Sharp is really the better player over Parker, but neither of these guys is costing you any money, so expect both of them, I would think, to show up in camp and get a shot to compete for the backup spots here. You move over to the guard position. This is really Hudson at center and Incognito at guard. This was just the strength of your offensive line. The offensive line, if you go back to the last offseason in 2018, the offensive line was a disaster. In 2018, it was hands down either one of the worst or the worst offensive line in all of football. This year, you saw a massive upgrade. You saw guys get better with Miller. You saw a couple of the starters come back who had been injured all of 2018, and then you saw the addition of Incognito, of course, who, in spite of his age, he's been playing forever, and he's had an excellent season. In fact, Incognito and Hudson were no doubt, hands down, the strength of the offensive line this year, especially when it came to guarding Derek Carr, okay, to keeping him clean, giving him a clean pocket, keeping pressure off of him. They did an outstanding. You just can't say enough about how good they were in pass coverage this year with Hudson and Incognito. So they both have a grade of 2, okay, and that's better than solid starter. That's a very good player, not the elite, but the very good. Trouble with Hudson and Incognito, though, as you look forward, they've got a lot of mileage on them. And you never know when you're going to start to see that performance dip off, okay? Matter of fact, you could even question if we started to see it dip off a little bit with Hudson. Hudson and Incognito have been absolute studs their entire career. As good a season as Hudson has, you had this year, you did start to see his performance tail off just a little bit. So Hudson and Incognito, expect them back next season, but with the caveat of at some point their performance is going to drop off, and you just don't know when. You just never know when. Incognito, a number of people would have said his performance would have dropped off several years ago. He's just been playing that long, and yet he had an excellent season for you. Incognito this year only cost you $6.8 million, okay? You could release him for no dead cap hit, but I don't see any reason to do that. If he comes back and plays at all, he doesn't have to even be as good as he was last year. If he comes back and plays at all, turns in a solid performance at starter, if he does that, he's worth absolutely every cent of $6.8 million, okay? So he's an absolute steal when you look over here at Brown making $21.5 million, and even at Hudson, who's making $14.5 million, okay? So when you come back and you look at Incognito, you think, man, we could cut him for $6.8 million, but he had such a tremendous season. Even if we do start to see his performance tail off due to age, he's worth every bit of this $6.8 million. As long as he suits up and he plays and he turns in another solid performance, that 6.8 is worth every single penny that you'll be paying for that. So you come back over here to Hudson and you see, man, $14.5 million. That's a lot of money to be paying a non-quarterback, a center. That's a lot of money. But I think they're going to keep him as well, provided they think, and listen, when you're the coach and you see these players day in and day out, and you see them in practice, you would assume you start to get a feel for whether or not age is starting to kick in, whether or not they're starting to slow down, whether or not this thing is starting to be a factor age-wise. But if they bring Hudson back, he's going to cost $14.4 million. They could even restructure this a little bit, okay? They've got room here if they wanted to restructure Hudson and get that cap number down a little bit, okay? It would cost $4.3 if they decided to cut or trade him. But I expect Hudson back. Hudson and Incognito, magnificent starters this year. Brown and Miller, solid starters this year. And then you come over here and you've got a guy in Gabe Jackson. This is where things start to get tricky. Gabe Jackson has done nothing for the Raiders but start his whole life, okay? He just starts every game. And so you respect the fact that he suits up and that he can play just about every game and he can start every game. But Gabe Jackson really, when you step back and you look around the league at the other guards in the league, Jackson is not one of the top 40 guards in the league right now, okay? So when you think about every team having 2 guards, that's 64 starting guards in the league, and Jackson really, when you look at him on tape and you watch his performance, don't let all the starts fool you into thinking that he's just an absolute lockdown starter. He's been a starter, and he has done reasonably well in that area, but you can improve on Gabe Jackson. The reason I bring that up is he's making $9.6 million this season, okay, which is not as much as Hudson, and it's not as much as Brown. But the dead cap hit for Gabe Jackson, if you decided to cut him or if you could trade him, is nothing. It would cost you absolutely nothing. So you could save $9.5 million right there by letting go of Gabe Jackson. And it always depends on what the rest of the offensive line looks like. If you assume that Incognito is coming back and having a solid year, and Hudson's coming back and at least having another solid year, and if you assume that Brown and Miller are coming back and having solid years, that gives you 4 guys on the offensive line that you feel good about. And so you start to be tempted here with Gabe Jackson, $9.6 million, I could save by cutting him. And so that starts to get a little bit interesting. Jordan Davey, who's a very good backup, I really don't want him starting. He'll be a free agent. I could bring him back for very cheap if I wanted to, and probably will. And then you've got Denzel Good here. Good really has not been a proficient starter throughout his league, but for only $2.5 million, I'm very tempted here to at least think about starting Denzel Good, or more likely bringing in a draft pick, okay? And it's really time. They've invested a couple of draft picks here, the Raiders did, with Miller and Parker, okay? And even with Sharp. But it's really time, I think, for them to look at investing in another draft pick here at guard, because you have so much age here with Incognito and Hudson, because you've got the free agent question, the cap number question here with Gabe Jackson. I think that I would really like to see the Raiders use a draft pick at guard, first round, second round, third round, somebody, and then keep Good here, and somewhere between those 2 players, you would either platoon them, or hopefully one of those guys would step forward and hold down the starting job. And I think you can afford to do that from a talent standpoint, because you have 4 other guys here that you feel pretty good about holding down those starting spots. And nothing is guaranteed, and injuries are always possible, and regression is always possible. But you have to feel pretty good from a talent standpoint about having 4 guys coming back here as solid starters. And if you add a draft pick here to go along with Denzel Good, I think you feel pretty good about that 5th player at least being halfway decent for you in 2020, and not seeing any kind of a massive drop-off here in offense due to the offensive line, okay? So you have James here as well. He's only costing you $588,000. Really, we haven't seen enough of him on the NFL films at all to know what he's going to do, okay? So offensive line, if you wanted to leave everything alone, okay, you've only got 1 free agent here. If you wanted to, and this is always an interesting question, if I'm happy with what I've got here at offensive line, and I just want to bring everybody back, can I do that? And the answer is yes. For just about $1 million, probably, you could bring back Jordan Davey for next year and have back your entire offensive line, okay? The reason that I would pause on that is this right here. $62 million. $62 million. That's how much money the Raiders have invested in their offensive line. This doesn't even count Derek Carr's cap number. This is just the offensive line. And that comes out to 31%. The cap next year, we don't know exactly, but the cap next year for 2020 is going to float somewhere around $200 million, okay? So out of the standard cap for next year, the Raiders have already, without spending another dime, the Raiders have already allocated 31% of their cap to the offensive line, okay? That doesn't count the quarterback. That doesn't count my weapons on offense. That doesn't count my field goal kicker and my punter. And that doesn't even begin to count anybody on defense, okay? So I've already taken almost a third of my cap, 31% of my cap for next season, and I've already given that to the offensive line. Now, I have not looked around the league. I don't know if there's another offensive line that's more expensive than this one around the league. I know Dallas Cowboys have a pretty good bit amount of money invested in their offensive line. This is a boatload of money to have invested in the offensive line. It's a lot, okay? And especially for an offensive line that's not top 5, it's not top 10. It was average and solid, and it's already starting to show some age here. That's a boatload of money to have tied up in one position group, okay? Any position group. This could be quarterbacks. This could be your secondary with the corners. This is a lot of money to have tied up in one position group, and that's what they've got, 31%, $62 million. So if I'm the Raiders front office, and again, they're not pinching pennies this year. They have cap space. They have cap flexibility. In fact, the $21 million that I have up here, they're going to have $21 million to roll over from 2019 that they didn't use. So in fact, their cap number is not going to be $200 million. They've got about $220 million to play with this year. So cap space is not necessarily an issue for the Raiders, but you just start to wonder. Gabe Jackson here, fringe starter, somebody who's not absolutely locking down the spot, somebody who maybe I could improve on with the draft pick. Would it not be a better use of my resources to take that $9.6 million and start to push it over into the defense or into my offensive weapons, some other kind of a category here, besides putting so much money here into the offensive line? And doing that would take you from $62 million down to about $53 million, which would still be, even at $53 million, would still be one of the most expensive offensive lines in all the NFL. So that's just something to think about there as the Raiders front office is looking at their offensive line. Yes, it's a good, solid offensive line. I think you can expect it to be good and solid next year. But do you really want to be paying $62 million for that cap, for that offensive line? Is it not a better use? And would we not rather get younger there as well, looking forward to 2021 and 2022, when you know Incognito and Hudson are going to really start showing signs of age? All right, I think we've covered everything today for the offensive line, quarterback spots, and the overall offensive look. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much for being with us today. Goodbye.